Hey everybody! Hope you're having a great day wherever you are in the world. It's almost noon, and busy chat we're about to have. We have lots to talk about. As I was telling folks yesterday in my live chat about the Capitol breach, what I was planning on doing was a video on Assange and the Assange ruling, and that got tabled because of everything that happened. But we're lucky enough, we're going to have Daniel Sheehan. He's actually in the background. Well, he's in California, so I'm going to plug him in a second. But he's been on the channel a few times, a wealth of information. I've said before, one of the few guys who can out-talk me, including my husband, but is generous enough to walk us through the Assange ruling. We're going to talk about what happened at the Capitol. We're going to talk about free speech online, because he's been somebody who's come on the channel to talk about that a lot. And, for instance, we know that Trump has been flagged and now shut down and his accounts locked on Twitter and Facebook. Talk about that. We're going to talk about Democrats taking over the Senate. We got a lot to talk about. So without further ado, Danny, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Awesome.
Which is not necessarily something you would think in these
I
times.
know. But as you said, you've been cool as a cucumber under worse circumstances. So,
Yep.
So
Yep.
Danny, you have worked on a lot of really high profile cases. You worked on the Pentagon Papers case. You've worked on the Iran Contra case. You started the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review. A lot of the cases you worked on, besides just free speech, have dealt with journalists and protecting their sources. And so if we start with Assange, I guess the first thing I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, and I do want to say to everybody first before we get into this, because we are going to take your questions. Danny's going to take your questions. But it would be easier for me, since the chats go a million miles an hour, if you could say @Allison, so actually tag me in your comment, so that I can see that and differentiate that between just you're arguing with somebody else in the chat, so that it's something you specifically want Danny. And maybe you could even just say @Allison Morrow and then put Danny in all caps or something, just so it's easier for me to see. But could we start with Assange? And if people are not totally familiar with what happened, can we start with both the charges, I guess, originally,
Yep.
and then what happened under the Trump administration?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what happened is that back in May, actually the original charges that were filed against him started because the executive branch of the United States government was furious with him for having published thousands of pages of secret U.S. Diplomatic cables that he got from Manning, who was a employee of the United States Security Department, who had legal access to these files. And Manning communicated these to Assange, who was the head of WikiLeaks, with a clear understanding that WikiLeaks was going to be publishing them to the world. In the administration at that time, the Obama administration were terribly upset about this, the national security state people, and they took steps to clearly get the Swedish, some people in Sweden, a couple women actually in Sweden, one particularly, to file a criminal complaint against Assange, asserting that he had had sexual intercourse with her, which was semi-voluntary. But when she discovered that he was not using a condom, she got terribly upset about him, and she, under pressure, I think, from the United States government, found out about this, and they had her file criminal charges against him in Sweden. And then they were trying to get the Swedish government to extradite him from England, to get him to Sweden, where they were clearly prepared to extradite him to the United States. The United States, under the Obama administration, had not filed any official criminal charges against him. And they were trying to use this device, this deception of having him extradited to Sweden on these weird charges of coercive sexual relations and molestation. And the Swedish government issued the warrant for him. He was brought to an arraignment in England and was given bail. and given a year to turn himself in to respond to the extradition demand from Sweden. When the time arrived for him to have to turn himself in, he decided that it was a setup by the United States government who retaliated against him for having published these documents, which we'll talk about in some more detail. But the bottom line is he sought political asylum in the embassy of Ecuador in London, and they granted him asylum. So he went into asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. And the Obama administration then was kind of flummoxed by not being able to get their hands on him, the national security state people who wanted to prosecute him here in the United States. And what happened is he stayed inside the Ecuadorian embassy for many, many months. And what happened is the legal case, as it were, up in Sweden sort of fell apart. The two of the statutes they charged him on, the statute of limitations ran out. In the last one, the prosecutor up there, a woman, finally decided that she was not going to prosecute that case against him. So those charges were all dismissed. And so therefore, there was no outstanding warrant really against him. In the Obama administration, we're kind of vacillating back and forth, having lots of discussions inside the Justice Department about whether to charge him and what to charge him with. They had the rulings of the Pentagon Papers case on behalf of the New York Times hanging over them. They had the rulings in the United States Supreme Court case recognizing the existence of a First Amendment privilege that news journalists had, which Assange qualified for. And so the Obama administration, Justice Department, was conflicted about whether to bring charges against him or not. But as soon as the Trump administration came in, Trump started thumping his chest about, protecting the national security of the United States and America first, et cetera. And so their Justice Department, out of the Eastern District of Virginia, which is viewed by all knowledgeable lawyers as the CIA's federal court. The Eastern District of Virginia is located within a stone's throw of Langley in Virginia, and they returned indictments against him. Without getting too technical, there were three additional, what they call superseding indictments. But they basically started charging him with offenses under a new set of statutes that had been passed. After the Pentagon Papers case had been won, after the journalists' rights had been secured, et cetera, the administration in 1980, in 81, under the Reagan-Bush administration, when they got control of both houses of the Congress, they passed a set of statutes making it illegal for anyone to receive national security information. And they were trying to get around all the problems that they had encountered with the First Amendment. It's a long story, but the bottom line is they passed a series of statutes in 1981, which had to do with receiving and communicating to any other person unauthorized to have it, national security information. Now they went to great lengths to focus this very narrowly on the fact that Assange, in receiving these documents from Manning, had published them on the internet, and he had not redacted the names of numerous people who were named inside these diplomatic cables and these activity reports, they called them, that he had gotten a hold of. I mean, we're talking about lots of documents. We're talking about, let me see the numbers, like 250,000 documents, including evaluations of the conditions, ironically, of prisoners that were being kept at Guantanamo. They got all kinds of this very sensitive information, and he put it out on the internet, and not only did not redact the names of people in Afghanistan and Iraq who had been providing information secretly to the United States government, but when challenged on that, he said he didn't really care whether those kind of people, were exposed or not. That wasn't his responsibility. And what happened is the the Trump administration's Justice Department focused in on that narrow area of him publicly revealing the identities of people who were providing sensitive information to the United States occupation forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, in the midst of all of the other information, which they did not cite as why they were trying to prosecute him, he was revealing the torture at Abu Ghraib. He was revealing the fact that the United States government was basically, under the Bush administration, Bush Jr., they were basically invading the Middle Eastern oil fields to occupy the Middle Eastern oil fields. And they were really angry about that because they had all kinds of diplomatic cables that revealed what it is that they were really doing and what they were really thinking. And they were exposed about all that. And it threatened the ability of the Bush administration, in alliance with the Democratic Party, you remember, that Hillary Clinton and Biden and John Kerry and all the other Democratic senators at the time supported the invasion and occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields. So the entire constabulary in Washington, D.C., the national security state constabulary, were all furious about the exposure of what it is that they were really doing in the Middle Eastern oil fields. And what they did is they settled in on this rationale that his exposing the names of some of the citizens in Afghanistan and Iraq that were giving information to the intelligence services of the United States to track down people who were opposing their occupation. They settled in on that, and there was a statute that they got passed under the Reagan administration, the Reagan-Bush administration earlier, about revealing the identity of intelligence officers. Now, that doesn't really apply to the sources that they had, these individual citizens, but they put a count into the indictment, charging him with revealing information that would reveal the names of intelligence sources. So this set of charges were put together by the Trump administration. And so when the charges up in Sweden having to do with having non-consensual sexual intercourse without a condom, when those fell apart, the Trump administration moved in as soon as they got into power, and they filed these criminal charges against him, and they demanded his extradition. That's what this case is all about. The demand for extradition that had been sent by the Trump administration Justice Department under Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, to the government of England, demanding his extradition and him being brought to the United States so they could prosecute him for 18 different federal criminal charges that would have ended up putting him in prison for life. And so the case came before the magistrate judge, Vanessa Baritzer. Vanessa Baritzer was a magistrate judge in the United Kingdom, in London, and she had the issue put before her as to whether or not she was going to respond and meet the demands of the Trump administration national security state to extradite Assange to the United States. And so what happened is, right this week, what's happened here is the magistrate judge has issued like a 135-page opinion.
Yeah. And actually, Danny, I'm going to show it. I'll scroll through it a little bit for people so they can kind of look at it while you're talking about her decision. I do real fast. I wanted to just say thank you to We Are Free TV for the super chat saying thanks for what you do. I'm sure that's for me and you, Danny. So thanks for that. Everybody is appreciating the, and if you're new in the chat, just a heads up, again, we're talking to constitutional attorney Daniel Sheehan. He's worked on a lot of really high profile constitutional First Amendment, right, Danny, journalism, like sources, all that good stuff, cases, has been working on these kinds of issues since the 60s, so he's very hard to frazzle. You can ask him whatever you want. He's here to take your questions live. We're starting with Assange. We're going to move into all the other stuff in a second. As you know, Assange, we're going to talk about the ruling. He's not going to be extradited to the U.S., but he is going to stay in jail. Danny's going to talk us through that. And if you have questions, I said earlier to make sure that you put at Allison Morrow or, just tag me in the comment and then just maybe put Danny's name in there somewhere just so I can differentiate that between folks who are just arguing and, or talking, debating, enjoying the chat itself between that and what really we want to pose to Danny. So, Danny, here's the PDF, okay? It's you and me, and we're looking at the PDF here, and I'm just going to scroll to people so they can see it. You don't have to tell us, a specific page or anything unless you want to, but just so people can kind of see what it looks like, how long it is. I've got some highlighted portions when we start talking about the mental health side of it. So I've heard a lot of discussion about this because the folks who have been kind of opining about it said, right decision, wrong reason. In other words, they're like, right. Hey, we're glad that the guy's not going to be extradited, but it doesn't do anything for press freedom. So can we talk about that?
Yes. Yeah. This first of all, this opinion, this some 135-page opinion, is probably one of the most sophisticated judicial opinions I've ever read. And this includes the 10 different written opinions that were rendered in the Pentagon Papers case for the New York Times, which I helped litigate for the New York Times, and the numerous opinions that were written in response to our demand that the American journalists be granted a right not to have to reveal their confidential news sources. This is an extraordinarily intelligent, well-reasoned, rational judicial opinion on the part of the magistrate judge. She came to the right conclusion that he should not be extradited, but in the process, she went through virtually every single argument that the defense had raised. And by the way, the people that were representing Assange, the defense counsel, were extremely sophisticated, extremely competent, and covered some dozen different issues as to why he should not be extradited. And they ranged all the way from the fact that they were asserting that the United States government under Trump was acting in bad faith, and that they were attempting to extradite him to the United States to punish him simply for revealing the secrets about the invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. And it went all the way down to the point where they very strangely but very profitably for themselves ended up asserting that she should not extradite him. Oh, by the way, after all of these profound arguments they made about his right to free speech, about the treaties that the United States had with the United States for extradition, had exceptions if in fact they were going to basically torture him and punish him. And she got through all of these, say 11 of the 12 arguments, and she came to this final argument where the defense actually asserted that there was an exception to the extradition laws between the United States and England, which made an exception for the fact that if a person had a high probability of committing suicide if they were extradited to this other country. A very peculiar argument, but they found a particular case in which that exception had been set forth. And what this really was, it was a Trojan horse argument to be able to get in front of the judge the extraordinarily punishing and cruel and unusual nature of the incarceration to which he would be subjected if he were extradited to the United States. And the real bottom line on this opinion is that the Judge Beretzer, became convinced that the nature of the incarceration to which he was going to be subjected if they extradited him to the United States, both prior to his trial and after his trial, if he were convicted, was so cruel and unusual and so punishing that she thought to herself that this violated a certain provision of the extradition treaty, to avoid having the person subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. But she wouldn't say that. She didn't rule that because that would have caused a major flap between England and the United States of criticizing the United States government. So what she did is she went off in this other direction, more or less at the behest of the defense counsel for Julian. And she said, look, the nature of the incarceration to which he would be subjected prior to any trial in the United States if he were extradited, and the incarceration to which he'd be subjected if he were convicted of any of these counts were so onerous and arbitrary and unusual that it would cause him to have a mental breakdown, and that he would be likely to commit suicide. And when she opened that particular door to the defense counsel, they rushed in with a half a dozen psychiatrists who began to put lots of information in front of the court about Julian Assange's mental condition. Now, this is something that a client usually isn't very desirous to have done.
Right.
But the defense counsel saw this opening to be able to get in front of the judge the nature of the cruel and unusual incarceration to which he would be subjected. Now, I'm aware of this because I've been in those facilities.
Well, and Danny, give me a second. I'm going to read just out of, since I have this up, I'm going to read people just a quick paragraph that's in the document, just describing, you know, they brought up other inmates in one particular case. And so they're describing this solitary confinement. So those inmates were in solitary confinement technically for 24 hours per day. There was absolutely no communication by any means with other inmates. The only form of human interaction they encountered was with correctional officers opened the viewing slot during their inspection rounds of the unit, when institution staff walked through the unit during their required weekly rounds, or when meals were delivered through the secure meal slot in the door. 1 hour recreation was offered to inmates in this unit each day. However, in my experience, oftentimes an inmate would decline this opportunity because it was much of the same as their current situation. The recreation area in the unit consisted of a small, barren indoor cell absent any exercise equipment. So does that sound...
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because I interviewed a number of times Ed Wilson, who was incarcerated at Marion Prison before they built the big special facility out in Denver in the federal correction system. Out at Marion Prison, they have what they call the K block, which is like four stories underground. And all of the people who have been accused of national security state violations are housed there. There were like a dozen of them. And they're on deadlock 23 hours a day with no visitors allowed. They get to talk one time a month to their lawyer on a telephone that's monitored and recorded. They get to exercise 1 hour a day, but that they usually do it in the middle of the night. They wake them up at between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. in the morning to give them an opportunity to spend 1 hour walking around in this little cubicle. And I saw those facilities with Ed Wilson, so I know what they're talking about. The judge focused probably 6 or 8 pages on the cruel and unusual nature of that type of incarceration. And she made a finding directly contrary to all the arguments that were being made by the lawyers for the Trump administration's Justice Department. She made a finding that, all of the pretense that they may not actually put him in those kind of incarceration circumstances was not true. It was very clear that she said it was very likely he was going to be put into those kind of confinements, and that she found that abhorrent. And so therefore she shifted right over to saying, okay, in order to avoid condemning the United States government for that form of incarceration of national security state prisoners, she moved over to the potential consequences on his mental health. And then they opened that door, and then the defense counsel walked through it and put in all kinds of expert witnesses testifying about the extremely oppressive psychological effects of that kind of incarceration on people in general, but very particularly on Assange, and made a number of rather embarrassing revelations to the court about Julian Assange's mental condition that had developed while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy and being isolated primarily. And that's what she confirmed.
That he was already kind of suffering, and that they had seen changes, that he had gotten better when taken out of a situation where he was not in like total lockdown, when he was allowed to have communication with people. And so if we transfer now to the press freedom side of this, what was at stake that a lot of people were concerned about if, in fact, Assange ends up getting tried and he's prosecuted and ends up in jail on this, the implications of that for journalism? I did see Noam Chomsky opining on this the other day,
Yeah.
saying basically that for the U.S. government, for the Biden administration, this is a win-win because it's like he's just going to stay in jail for now,
Yes.
but they don't have to put him through a hearing where then again these
Public
embarrassments
trial.
would be exposed. And so,
Yep.
so can we talk about both things? I guess starting with what was at stake, and then of course I do want to ask your opinion on kind of what you think on the media coverage of it all. Should it have gotten more attention? Are we just too fixated on, you know, stuff like Kanye West and Kim Kardashian getting divorced, and so we don't care about these topics anymore? Or do you think there is something more intentional in the media's decision to not necessarily cover this on a regular basis?
That's right. No. So taking those sort of in order, the reality is that that Assange basically took to heart all of the implications of the rulings that we secured in the Pappas case for the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources, the Pentagon Papers case of allowing journalists to get access to national security information and make it publicly available. What he did is he took to heart all of the implications of the rulings, most of which I've been personally involved in securing from the United States Supreme Court, and he took them to the full ultimate. And what he did is he openly solicited national security information on WikiLeaks. He would put out on the internet saying, "Here are the kind of documents I'd like to get our hands on. We, WikiLeaks, will agree to publish these things to the world. Here are our capture." He played this capture the flags game. He talked about that. Here are the 12 flags that I really want you to capture on, you know, like the old kids game of capture the flag at the top of the hill. And he was flagrant about his defiance of the national security state sensitivities, which many of us are sympathetic with him on that. You know, they're clearly overdoing it. And plus the whole purposes of the design of the national security state here in the United States is primarily to be able to mount covert operations in direct military invasions around the world to secure continuing privileged access to the strategic raw materials which they view to be needed by the United States corporations. I mean, that's what, and that's why Noam Chomsky will talk about that. That's what's really going on here. And what Julian did is he basically put his thumb right in the eye of the national security state, and he solicited this type of information. And there was a specific set of findings in the decision, or at least there were arguments that were made by the United States government, that it was clear that Manning, inside the national security state employment where she was, had responded directly to the direct solicitations that had been made by Julian on the internet, and provided specific information in response to specific requests on the part of Julian that had been issued publicly. And so the bottom line is that because Julian Assange took to the full possible rational extent the full implications of some of the victories that we had won over the previous 20 years, having to do with journalists' right to get access to national security information, he basically overdid it. And he engaged the wrath of the national security state at full flower. And the mistake that he may know about this because of the conversations that were going on. I represented the New York Times along with Floyd Abrams and others in the Pentagon Papers case. And what happened is that Julian, in his conversations with the people at the New York Times, said to them that he didn't care whether the people who had provided information to the United States invasion and occupation forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, he didn't care if they got exposed. And he didn't care if the forces of the Islamic Brotherhood in the Middle East hunted these people down and killed them. And it freaked out Floyd Abrams, and it freaked out the other lawyers at the New York Times so much that they began to distance themselves from him. And therefore, it left him exposed. They wouldn't protect him with regard to the revelation of those individual names. Now, that's what the Trump administration Justice Department lawyers picked up on. They knew that there was that division inside the First Amendment community here in the United States and their lawyers between them and Julian Assange. And so what they did is they went after Julian right at that weak point. That was the Achilles heel of Julian. And the Justice Department under Trump was smart enough and focused enough to go after that. And that's what they did. So that what we have to do for the purposes of this discussion, let's set aside for at least one moment this issue of the intentional and willful revelation to the world of the names and identities of confidential sources that provide information to the national security state forces of the United States in foreign places, because it's almost sui generis. That's an issue sort of in itself. But the rest of the issues, the penumbra issues that surround that more narrow issue, are extraordinarily important. And these are the ones that I've devoted most of my professional life to protecting and extending, to provide the kind of space that journalists need to dig out the kind of information about the torture at Abu Ghraib, the lack of justification in believing that weapons of mass destruction were in the possession of Saddam Hussein. All of those internal documents that reveal the perfidy of the United States national security state people is an extraordinarily important service to be provided in a democracy. And Julian was doing that. And in that regard, he had support that had been gained over a 20-year period by myself and others in the legal profession to give this kind of space to journalists, to be able to do that stuff. But he, in fact, abused it in their view. And I think it's parenthetically important to point out that when I was first contacted and asked to represent an NBC television journalist, a fellow named John Pappas, up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, back in 1969, I was the first lawyer ever to assert a First Amendment right for journalists to protect our confidential news sources. And I did it after most of these other lawyers and the people at the Cahill Gordon law firm that represented NBC News refused to take that position. They refused to assert that there was a First Amendment right to protect your confidential news sources. And so that's why John Pappas, the young television reporter from NBC in New Bedford, came to us at the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review to actually argue that case for him. And we argued in the Superior Court in New Bedford, Massachusetts, then before the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, and ultimately up into the United States Supreme Court. And when we arrived at the United States Supreme Court, it turned out that since we were just law students and weren't even members of the bar yet, the NBC went to the Cahill firm, went back to them to get them to argue the case in front of the United States Supreme Court. And John Pappas took the position that he wasn't going to allow them to represent him because they didn't even believe in the existence of the right to begin with. And so he insisted that we, who were still at Harvard Law School, represent him in front of the Supreme Court. And that's why the Cahill firm sent one of their partners to Harvard Law School to recruit me, to actually get to come to their law firm to make that argument for them. And so I did. And so I was there during the internal discussions among the kind of legal elite in the United States about where these lines were going to get drawn, what kind of arguments we were willing to make, et cetera. And what happened is Julian took advantage of all of those victories that we had achieved over a 20-year period and took them to the penultimate limits. And he basically, just as I say, stuck his thumb in the eye of the national security state and just hung out there. And the problem is that he wasn't aware of what the full consequences might be. And he has now been confronted by them. They first tried to set him up on a bunch of false charges up in Sweden, and then they came after him with all these new statutes that they passed under the Reagan-Bush administration. If I were his lawyer, and a number of people had approached me to ask me whether I was willing to represent him or not, if I were his lawyer, I would say to him, what did you expect? If everything think is true, what do you think they're going to do to you? And that's what they're doing to him right now.
So, well, and I want to get back to that, but I do have somebody has a question for you here.
Yep.
Hot Mom, Danny question, what is the primary reason and motivation for the folks pushing for a pardon? What is it they expect to be exposed? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure what he means by what would be exposed. Well, let me figure out the real question here. What they're really concerned about, the national security state is extremely concerned about allowing an institution like WikiLeaks to continue functioning the way it was. The soliciting to the public national security state information, and from anybody inside the bureaucracy that has access to this information, so that any person inside the national security state bureaucracy who becomes upset about what's going on, or they don't like their boss or anything like that, that is willing to provide to journalists national security information, which will then be put up on the internet, unfiltered, unanalyzed. That is a situation that the national security state cannot suffer. They will not allow that to take place. Now, I've been at crossed swords with the national security state infrastructure in the United States for 20 years. I know so far what I've been able to get away with and assist the journalist community in getting away with a lot more than most anybody else in the legal community thought we could. But that takes extreme care. That takes real clear thinking, real careful argumentation, and a willingness to push forward step by step what these rights and privileges are without overdoing it at a particular moment. So I think that Julian almost was verging on kind of anarchy, an anarchistic kind of position that all information about the national security state should be revealed. And basically, he didn't even care whether the United States national security state collapsed entirely, because, like for example, with others, Noam Chomsky and others, so what? That's a good thing. Let's have the national security state of the United States collapse so they can't go around invading countries and having 800 military bases around the world, gathering together resources for their corporations. That's an extreme position, and that's what Julian was basically advocating and promulgating. And what they've done is they've nipped that in the bud, and they were willing to go to. I mean, it's actually quite extraordinary that he wasn't killed. Hasn't been murdered.
Well, actually,
because the national
I was going to bring that up because in that document, when I read that portion about the description of the prison conditions that he'd be subjected to, like right under that, the judge had written about Jeffrey Epstein. And I didn't want to throw you a curveball and say, what do you think about the Jeffrey Epstein thing? But it's, right there. She says he committed suicide, but of course, I'm sure people in the chat would just go crazy about whether the whole Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself meme has been going around for quite a while now. So.
And I agree with your discretion on that point, because it's like a whole other subject, a whole other show. But the bottom line is the United States national security state has been engaged in assassination programs of people around the world, ever since at least 1959, 1960. I've dug all that stuff out. I've seen the documents. I've interviewed the people that were involved. So I know they do that. And actually, it's extraordinary that Julian wasn't already killed. Now, there was some minor reference in the case, the opinion, actually, of allegations that there were efforts made to poison him, inside the embassy. Mm-hmm. Clear, and the judge was extremely diplomatic about avoiding going down certain roads, but she was very astute in at least making clear that the issue was presented to her, and that she didn't go down that road. But the bottom line is that, backing up again to the issue of what is at stake here, right. Julian has pushed the case beyond the limits that the industrial state of the United States and their entire juridical system were willing to accept. And so what he's done is he's actually generated a set of statutes and a set of precedents now, or he's participated in it. He didn't do it single-handedly, but that it's basically caused the legal community in the United States, even the First Amendment legal community, to basically ostracize him. And to say that, oh, look what he's done. He's damaged all the progress we've made. They've set up all these exceptions. And this case that Judge Bereitzer has written is devastating with regard to a lot of these issues. She has ruled consistently against the defense. And if you say there's a dozen different legal issues that she addressed in the course of her opinion, 11 of them she ruled against the defendants. She ruled against them, systematically. And it was because of the precision of the focus of the federal criminal complaint that was filed by the Justice Department against him, focusing on the willful, intentional exposure of the names of people who were sources of information to the United States intelligence services, and that he basically wasn't going to get across that line. They were going to draw the wagons up, and she would agree with them to allow the national security state to function in a way that their sources in the areas that they invaded and occupied were protected. Okay, so that's what the nature of this case is all about. But at the same time, she wasn't willing to participate in allowing the national security state to suicide Julian Assange. She wasn't willing to allow them to do that. And she was quite convinced that they were going to do that they were going to put him in conditions of incarceration, that were going to try to instigate him and take advantage of any kind of mental weaknesses that he had suffered to get him to commit suicide. And then they would all go, alas and alack, and anybody that believes that Epstein committed suicide, ought to have their head examined. So this situation is extraordinarily important. But her opinion in the other 11 sectors of her opinion that she wrote was extremely protective of at least a narrow range of information that the national security state wants protected. So she recognized that, and she acknowledged the legitimacy of that. And it's going in the wrong direction, but it's not an area that I would have ever wanted to go into and try to assert the right of journalists to reveal the names of sources for our intelligence community, even as much as I disagree with the ultimate mission of our United States intelligence services. I don't agree with them, but I wouldn't be foolish enough to try to assert that the journalists had the right to dig out the information about that and publish it to the whole world with full expectation that they would be tracked down and killed. I wouldn't go that far.
Let me ask you, we got one question that may not specifically have to do with this. Maybe it has to do with other stuff. This is with courts inventing, this is from Steven, with courts inventing excuses to avoid hearing a case, what value is the First Amendment guarantee of the right to petition the government for redress of grievances?
Well, you would have to answer that with regard to different periods of time in our judicial system. Right now, we're confronted by the fact that the Trump administration has appointed almost 300 federal judges during the 4 years of the Trump administration, and they're virtually every single one of them members of the Federalist Society, and they have an extraordinarily protective bent toward the national security state that you can bet on. The bottom line is that if you think that during this period of time, over the next decade, that you're going to have any ability to go to the judicial system and get them to affirmatively support any further development of rights as a plaintiff, to protect your First Amendment rights, to protect the right of journalists, to protect the right of the public to know about what's going on with their government, et cetera, you ought to have your head examined, because that isn't going to work. or the next 10-year period. I'm confronted by the challenge of figuring out what to do. I've been asked by a major university here in California to consider teaching the constitutional law course next fall or whenever the law schools open up again. And it's a quandary as to what you're supposed to teach young lawyers coming out of law schools about this whole area. So frankly, with regard to the next 10-year period, I would not propose undertaking any type of affirmative litigation, trying to solicit the support of the judicial system to help protect any interests that have to do not only with the First Amendment, but any other constitutional rights, because all they're going to do is set up terrible precedents. But there is a line of reasoning that has been set forth and developed over the previous 20-year periods prior to, I would say, the Reagan administration coming in, that we were making progress. We were making progress, and I was able to optimistically propose to young law students that there were lines of analysis that one could take that could expand these rights of journalists and of the rights of people to know, et cetera. But that time is not going to come back for another decade or so.
Real fast, I wanted to get back to, let's move on. I want to move on to the Capitol stuff because this has all been very enlightening, but I don't want to take up too much of your time today, Danny, because I know you got at least dinner to get to in 5 hours, and we still have a lot more to get to. But just so that you have a chance to clarify what you're saying, because I was looking through the chats, and maybe I missed this, but AREM was saying it, quote, did you say anybody who believes Epstein committed suicide ought to have his head examined, but didn't Judge Barrister use Epstein's suicide in her ruling?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, the answer is yes to both of those.
Okay, so you think she should have her head examined?
She didn't use it. She actually dropped it all the way down to a footnote, because I was wondering whether she was going to cite it directly, because it turns out that the very facility that they were going to incarcerate Julian in, if they got him extradited, was the very facility in which Epstein came to be dead. And so she was suggesting that it was into the context of how good is their security, how good is their system that's in place to protect people against suicide, and very importantly, how conducive to people committing suicide are the conditions in that facility. And so she was implicitly saying that, yeah, the conditions inside that facility do induce people to consider suicide, and for them to try to assert that, look, our system is really appropriate to stopping people from committing suicide even if they want to, she dropped a little footnote and said, oh yeah, well, what about Epstein? And she was implying that even taking the government at its word that, oh, he committed suicide, their argument fails. So that was as far as she really went. And as you know, there's been no responsible or effective investigation, really, about what it is that happened to Epstein. But I could have laid down $100 bet with as many people that wanted to take it that guy was not going to come out of that facility alive.
So, okay, let's move on to the Capitol. Because I want to talk about. All right, there's so much to discuss here, because where I want to end up is with then the suspension of Trump's social media accounts, because I really would like your thoughts on the topic I cover a lot on this channel, which is, again, like, if it's kind of interesting because it does sort of mirror Assange in a way, in the sense that, is there a line, I guess, right? And there does appear, even among journalists, to be this, like you said, free speech, and some of these cases divide what would normally maybe be a homogenous thinking group of people, or maybe it isn't, I don't know. But like in journalists, you'd think like, oh yeah, we're all about press freedoms. But it's been interesting to see journalists debating what's too dangerous to be seen. And then the president of the United States being considered one of those purveyors of that. But before we get to that, I will say, and I would like to, because as I was watching all this happening, and of course it's just like everybody else, I was just glued to like, what is happening here? But I have to say, if I were to just look at the action itself of occupying a building in protest of whatever your idea is, it's certainly not the first time I've seen that. And I've been, back when DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was a very hot topic for environmental activists. I was regularly with them, chaining themselves inside Chase banks. And
Yep.
and so I had to sit back and think to myself, okay, like what is the difference here? And I'd be just curious from your standpoint, because as my husband often says, having been in the military, one person's insurrectionist is another person's freedom fighter. And
Yep.
do we look at these differently depending on if we agree with the ideology behind it? And then secondly, what I also found fascinating about yesterday also was to see, as you brought up, like George Bush and, these previous administrations and present, who, saying like this is an assault on democracy and it's a devaluation of this, these institutions that mean so much in America. And just being the contrarian, I guess, that I am, and just devil's advocate and thinking through it, my original thought was like, well, where, are you saying you guys, like in your offices, have never desecrated, democracy and the people's will? And it just seemed like, all these people, like I said, like even like when I read Bush's letter, for instance, and I just started thinking about that, like everything that happened under his administration, and it just made me like, are we, so there did seem to be kind of a little bit of hypocrisy, I guess, on that end. Not to downplay what happened yesterday, but those were my initial thoughts. Was like, okay, let's just take away the symbology here, and let's take away whether we agree or disagree, we hate Trump, we like Trump, or whatever. Is that different than those protests I was covering as an environmental reporter, where people were occupying a bank and refused to leave in the name of what they believed was like their last option to stop something that they felt was imminently dangerous, and just take away your emotion? Like what? So I'm just curious what you think. I mean, I try to think through things from just what am I not hearing other people asking? And those were some of the questions that I had. So just give me the floor on that.
No, good. No. I hear and fully understand exactly what you're saying. And the reality is that one of the things that you learn how to do, ideally, in going to law school, is to be able to parse issues so that this flood of conflicting feelings and kind of gastronomic responses that one has to a whole set of circumstances can be disentangled. Because as long as they stay so entangled like that, you can't really get a clear idea of what to say about any of them. And so what you have to do is back up and disentangle a lot of these seemingly conflicting emotional responses that one has to a set of circumstances like yesterday. And the first and foremost is that whatever principles that you want to resort to invoking in support of your argument, they have to be equally applicable to situations in which you're sympathetic with the person that's making the argument, or you're opposed to the person who's making the argument. That's one of the very first principles that you have to really be able to develop. The whole concept of jurisprudence in objective law is the discernment and articulation and deployment of operative principles that will apply to the same kind of situation, whether you agree or disagree with the conflicting characters in it. Okay, so that's the first thing. And there's been an abject failure of that principle in these recent events that have gone on during the 4 years of the Trump administration, because the liberal and progressive community are so offended by Trump and what he represents to them. They're willing to countenance activities and stuff that are undertaken that are normally abhorrent to any progressive person. Ideas of censorship, restriction, allowing, illegal searches and seizures to try to get information against him and the people that work with him, et cetera. And so there's been a diminution of the value of neutral principles over the period of the last 4 years that is quite remarkable and dangerous to the entire edifice of law, of objective law. Now, all of that having been said, it's important to remember that the people who make the laws, not only here in the United States, but virtually everywhere in the world, are the people in positions of power who are making the laws and ostensibly discerning these neutral principles, usually in favor of their own interests. That's all true. Okay, so you have to know that both of those things are true. And so what you say in response to your direct question, that it's clear that the activity of occupying a building which has symbolic importance, is a tactic that is equally usable and available to people on the left or the right of the political spectrum. And so that what happened there, if those people yesterday had, come into the Capitol building and flooded the Capitol building with 30,000 people, if all the 30,000 people that were called into Washington by Trump had peacefully marched down or up, actually, from the White House to the Capitol building, and gone into the Capitol building, they clearly had enough people to overwhelm any kind of at least moderately nonviolent resistance that they were offered by the Capitol Police. They could have gone in and occupied the entire building, occupied all of the offices, both House and Senate, sat in the chambers, and searched out the documents, for example, that were essential to certify the Electoral College vote, and found the documents and seized the documents symbolically and held the documents because they didn't agree with, whether they didn't agree with the Electoral College concept or they didn't agree with the particular decisions that had been made. They could have done that in an extraordinarily effective demonstration that would have been virtually identical to, for example, the occupation of University Hall at Harvard University in 1968, or the occupation at Columbia University of the administration building, or the encircling of the Pentagon by anti-war demonstrators who circled the Pentagon and locked arms and sat down and prayed in front of the Pentagon. So it's absolutely true that there were, in fact, opportunities that were available to that whole crowd yesterday that were not taken. And part of that is because one of the major appeals that Trump was making to those people was based on anger and fury, and a desire to sort of tear down the institutional structures that he was trying to convince them were so completely corrupted that they should be basically taken down. And so that when you saw people picking up chairs and breaking windows and destroying property and stuff like that, that was venting that kind of rage. And most of the time, in the demonstrations and occupations, building occupations that have been undertaken by people to the left of the spectrum, usually don't have that element. They usually go in and sit down and they're singing Kumbaya and they're holding up signs and all that. Now, there have been exceptions to that in just the last year. For example, in Minneapolis, burning down the police station in Minneapolis. I mean, with hundreds of people dancing in the flames of the police burning down.
Seattle, same thing. There was that Chaz. Yeah. Remember the People's Republic of Chaz, or CHOP, or whatever, Capitol Hill takeover too.
Free zone.
But I do know what you're saying, because, and I was thinking through that yesterday as well, that the direct actions that I have covered have been very thought out, in the sense that, like, they almost even know who's the person that wants to get arrested. Like, it's all planned out to the end, like what the end game is, what we're doing. And I wasn't totally sure watching that go down that there was like an end game, and that in a strategic sense, like you're talking about. It seemed like what you said, like, and I was listening to somebody on the radio who was there talking about it, that it was kind of this, just like they didn't realize they were going to break that barrier with the police, and then once they did, then it was just like, what are we going to do now? And now we're just going to keep going, and and you're right, like a lot of the not to say that I haven't been on protests as well. Like, I've talked about a protest where somebody got shot, where it was just like, we're just walking around downtown and there's no purpose, and then it just goes nuts and bonkers. So there is both. But you're right. Like, when it comes to the occupation side, like you're strategically going into occupy a building to get your point across. I will say the stuff that I've covered has been just a little bit more organized and strategic than what I saw yesterday.
That's right. And so you saw these remarkable scenes where the people were throwing sky hooks up over the banisters and climbing up the side of the walls, like in a movie, and once they get inside, they were saying, now what? They get inside. They've scaled the walls of the Citadel, and they've gotten inside, and now they don't know what to do. And they were literally walking aimlessly around in the Senate chambers, not knowing what to do. One guy gets up and sits in the seat of the president of the Senate, the vice president, and sits there kind of mimicking them. That was
that
funny,
the guy that was wearing the like fox or like bison helmet thing?
Yeah, there were a bunch of those guys. And then the other person went into Nancy Pelosi's office, and sat down and found a manila envelope and wrote out, "He shall not back down," and then put his feet up on the table and started taking selfies. Yeah. I mean, that's not exactly strategic planning. And so that they were ineffective in achieving any of their strategic goals. In fact, it backfired, as you saw. It caused a number of the senators that were going to be were going to be supporting the objections to the certification of the Electoral College. They lost 6 of their 11 supporters. So they lost half of their support, and it really rebounded against the interest of Trump. And very importantly, he's basically expended his ability. That I've had long conversations with people. They were concerned that as January 20th approached, that Trump was going to hole up in the White House, haul in 30,000 of his supporters and have them the White House and hold the White House and make the military come and try to extract him from the White House and do all that. But he's not going to be able to do that now. He basically it's the old Revolutionary War thing where you put wads into a flintlock and you shoot your wad. What he's done is, there's other implications. Anyway,
yeah.
The bottom line is I want to avoid using that image, but the bottom line is that he's basically made his play with these people doing this, and now he's lost the opportunity to do that thing with the White House. Because they're not going to respond to this thing again. They're going to have military all around the White House protecting it for the new administration. So but let's get back to the neutral principles. That there has been almost a complete, well, I'd say more than 50% dissolution of the support for neutral principles over the last 4 years on the part of the right and the left, to the point where you're getting people, and I've been deeply concerned about that as a constitutionalist and as a lawyer that understands the value of institutional concerns for transporting things of value from our past into our present, and at the same time championing the dynamics of change and progressive change. I support all of those things. And the fact of the matter is that there are certain aspects of the legal system that are absolutely essential for us in the vast majority to be able to step by step take control of the government that was created by the elite for their own self-interests. That's really what's going on here in the United States. There's a step-by-step process pursuant to which the vast majority of us are incrementally taking over the institutions of government that were created by the financial and commercial class who created the United States government, for their own advantage, commercial advantage. And we were making good progress on that. Not as much progress as everybody pretended, but the bottom line is that the 4 years of the Trump administration have basically exposed the kind of delicate nature of the progress that we're making. And you've heard that old saw hammered a bunch of times, is that we've gone backwards in trying to protect the institutions of democracy during the last 4 years. And more importantly, in the present time, the problem is that the Biden administration is now being more or less authorized by all the media to spend their entire time trying to get back to a middle marginalist, right of center kind of set of policies in the United States. and get Goldman Sachs back in charge, get all the same people back in charge that would have been in charge if Hillary Clinton had been elected, in 2016. They're all going to go back to that kind of comfortable comfort food kind of position. And the progressives in the Democratic Party, led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, are trying to keep going forward with the momentum of progressivism with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and that whole crowd. So you're not only going to be getting a fracturing of the Republican Party coming up, this right-wing reactionary Trump element in the thing, and then the other normal conservative group that's basically probably going to be led by John Kasich, in 2024. You're going to get probably Kasich being the nominee of the Republican Party in 2024. And the debate's going to go on inside the Democratic Party as to whether or not Kamala Harris is going to be coronated by the Democratic National Committee as the person to take over when Joe Biden steps down at the end of one term, or whether Ocasio-Cortez is going to mount a major progressive assertion, a surge forward in the Democratic Party. So that's the real story that's going on here that we're all watching take place in front of us.
Yeah, and I think that's, as I was thinking through this too, I really do believe that, and I've read other journalists say this, and I do think there is kind of a divide among people looking at where we're at in history right now as, do you see this as just this crazy anomaly, unexplainable crazy anomaly, or can you see the buildup in how we got here? And the people who are kind of like, this is just this this virus that we just got to get rid of and everything will go back to normal. See the world a certain way, right? And then they probably also, as we get into this next conversation about what this could potentially do to online speech. But if you're someone who does believe that if you just get rid of this particular this virus that is Trump, and then just all these things go back to normal, you're going to see the world differently and how to handle it differently than if you're somebody who is seeing it as more of a continuation of a timeline that has been moving forward. So moving to where we're at now, and you and I were talking before we started the stream about what CNN was saying in regards to, I didn't see that, but you did, so maybe you can comment on that about what to...
Let me just say, Allison, let me just, as we close off this portion of our conversation, let me say this, is that I am convinced that what the Trump administration's 4 years are basically the sort of logical culmination of a process that began right with the Reagan administration, coming toward the end of the Cold War, with the voluntary stepping back on the part of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev from the 75-year Cold War, the fundamental dialectic between socialism and capitalism. That when he stepped back from the Cold War, what you saw happen was the right-wing elements in the Republican Party just surged forward and kind of reasserted all the same principles that governed the robber baron era. That went from 1868 to 1898 here in the United States at the end of the American Civil War. That whole pushing forward the corporate capitalism, the kind of greed and avarice that is good for America and America first, that led to the American age of imperialism, taking over the Hawaiian Islands and Guam and Cuba and all of that. That came right back into the forefront. That's what happened. That pushing forward was basically seizing control of the Republican Party. And that's why it ended up choosing Donald Trump to be the promulgator of those types of principles. And the problem is that the Democratic Party didn't know how to respond to that because they had spent 75 years becoming the kind of apologetic for capitalism. That they were saying, oh, look, the Republican Party is too excessive. We've got to have Republican light, of having Social Security and unemployment insurance and some of these kind of things so we can avoid socialism. We want to avoid socialism coming in. And so that they had that role, the Democratic Party, for that entire time. And when the Soviet Union withdrew and the whole, quote, threat of socialism sort of receded, the right-wing elements in the Republican Party surged forward and started asserting raw greed and avarice and power. And that's what was really going on. And the Democratic Party didn't know what to do about it. And so they were powerless. And until such time as a genuinely progressive reasonable element inside the Democratic Party rises up and asserts legitimate control over the Democratic Party in the face of the splintering of the Republican Party, they aren't going to solve the problem, because only progressive policies will address the fundamental principles of reactionaryism. Liberalism will not do it.
Don't you think, though, that there, as with probably any politician, particularly presidential campaigns, that there's sometimes a difference between like the promises and the image and the branding and then the reality, and that there are people who voted for Obama, for instance, who may have bought into, as the whole drain the swamp, that message worked really well for, in 2016, and that there were a lot of people who really felt like that was gonna happen, and that we were gonna get rid, and that's how I feel that kind of energy under him was maybe what you're saying about like the building up of that robber baron political class. But I feel like a lot of people at this point, both on the left and on the right, are sick of that, and whether you could have an absolutely fair debate about whether Trump succeeded or even it tried to really do what he said. But is it fair to say that people who voted him, I don't think, like the average Trump voter I know, for instance, I don't think was saying, I want to continue with crony capitalism. I think it was just the opposite. And his language and personality exuded that, and that was why people elected him. I don't know.
That's right. No, that has to do with that concept. I'm talking about disentangling the different threads here to really get a comprehensive view of this. That I believe that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I believe there's going to be a major grassroots movement in the United States to draft her for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in 2004. People don't know this, but she turns 35 on October 13th of 2024, making her eligible for the 35-year age limit for a president. And that there's going to be a huge movement to draft her, and an entire cabinet, not just her as some personality, but an entire cabinet of people that are progressive people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, et cetera. And that there's going to be a huge confrontation that goes on inside the Democratic Party between those people and Kamala Harris as the coronated, anticipated person to succeed Joe Biden when he retires after one term. That's going to happen. Okay, and that's what the dynamic is that's going to be going on inside the Democratic Party, while the Republican Party sort of splinters. The Lincoln Project people, the Never Trumpers, are going to try to resuscitate a genuinely conservative party and try to dichotomize and push to one side the reactionary, authoritarian, right-wing, fascist element and this whole robber baron mystique that's inside the Republican Party. So I think that we may be in danger of seeing the two-party system in the United States, or the benefit of the two-party in the United States, disintegrating into a four-party coalition of a progressive party, a liberal party, a conservative party, and a reactionary party.
Yeah.
That may well be what's happening. And so I'm going to be advocating that the Democratic Party stay together in a moderately progressive party that is going to meet the demands of all the people, a lot of the people that supported Trump.
And actually, that's a great point.
Power, all that stuff. A lot of those people are going to say, a lot of those people were supportive of Bernie Sanders. They say, I didn't know whether I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders or Trump, because they both are criticizing major state capitalism and American imperialism and all that, the abuse of the working class, the disregard and disrespect for the regular people that are not college graduates, all of that stuff are things that the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coalition has to be able to engage and address their needs, which I think she's planning to do.
Let me ask you this.
To the Green New Deal.
Because somebody actually brought that up in the chat right as you were saying that. So we're a little bit before, so I thought that was interesting. Danny, is there a forward-moving play where elements on the right and the socio-left like AOC work together to truly drain the swamp? That was the question.
That's right. No, and I believe that she's going to be doing that. And that they need assistance. They need people from all across the political spectrum coming to be clear about what the complaints are that we all have, about the way that the government has been functioning over the last 50 years, to what are the cures that we need. But we have to get past this one thing. This is something I'll have to set aside for another conversation later. But this whole denigration of reality, of factual information. I mean, this invocation on the part of Donald Trump of complete fictional truths, and characterizing everything else as false news or fake news is extraordinarily dangerous. We have to come to some agreement on basic factual information. And the one area that's the most important for everybody to come to grips with is the issue of global climate change and the implications of the fossil fuel industry on our climate. And Trump and the oil magnates and the robber barons are all promulgating all of this major propaganda, trying to get people to believe that it isn't true, that it's somehow sunspots or some normal cycles that are occurring. That isn't true. And one of the advantages that I've had over the last 50 years now is I try to bring a set of factual details in front of everybody through the litigation process of discovery and documenting factual information, so that people can know at least what the facts are. And the facts are that we're really in danger of substantially damaging the global climate of our people, and everybody's got to come to realize that and figure out how, under the auspices of greening the economy and increasing employment for people and getting better educational opportunities for everybody, better health services for everybody, come all together to have a genuine people's government, and push these robber barons and the elite corporate capitalists and their financiers off to one side. We don't want to lose the value of entrepreneurial spirit, and we certainly don't want to denigrate entrepreneurial private enterprise, not corporate enterprise, where the stockholders all sit back and clip coupons and are immunized against any legal liability for the wrongdoing of their corporations. We've got to have a rising people's movement in the country that solve these problems genuinely, and it's going to have to come into power in 2024.
So I want to, gosh, there's so much to talk about. I want to address that, especially since I was an environmental reporter. But I really also want to get to your thoughts on the online speech stuff as it relates to all of this and everything. Yeah. So just to back up for a second, just to take my experience in Washington State, and I have Don Nix, thanks for the super chat. You're up right here. And I'm going to go through some other comments and questions, guys. So just stay with us because I know we're running through a lot of material really quickly. But what I found to be the most divisive when it came to climate change and the environment, covering a slew of issues, not just that, was feeling like the small business owner versus the activist, or the business owners who felt like the average person who felt like there were all kinds of rules and policies and taxes, for instance, that weren't necessarily they were actually more like a tax on the little person, still helping the big people. Like Jay Inslee, our governor in Washington, has come under a lot of criticism for his taxes because it hasn't necessarily, they keep saying, well, we just need more time, but it hasn't achieved in, a considerable amount of time what they were promising. And so a lot of people are like, I don't want to, I can't afford these car tabs along with the property taxes, along with, so you hear, and these are not people who hate the environment. There's a lot of agreement on wanting to take, there are obviously differences on people saying, this would be my solution to it. But I do think, unfortunately, that, and I got it all the time at trying to sit in between people who are just couldn't get along, but it was you guys actually agree on your value of the environment. It's just oftentimes they feel like, and I think that was criticism of AOC's Green New Deal, for instance, were there parts of it that were going to just make, farming, for instance, what were you going to do with farmers that felt like they weren't going to be able to pursue their work anymore? And I hated looking at it well, because this often, no matter what the cause is, a lot of people are just well, figure it out. And I was like, well, hey, you guys could have maybe people who would be on your side if you could help them figure out how to move forward.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing. Our office here, the Romero Institute, where I am, we've drafted a 350-page bill for the state of California, greening California. and it addresses all 13 major sectors: transportation, clean water, jobs, financing, et cetera. And what we're planning to do is to gain control of state power here in California, to exercise state power on behalf of regular people and on behalf of small business people, not in the interests of large major corporations. And because the big corporations get away with paying almost no taxes at all because they have this entire battery of lawyers that lobby the legislatures and get exemptions made for them. And the regular business people, little middle of the road business people, don't have that kind of a set of lawyers. And so they end up paying the taxes. So what we have to do is redesign the whole tax packages here in California to focus the taxes on and powerful corporations and relieve the regular smaller businesses of those kind of burdens and those kind of regulations and extreme filing requirements and all of that stuff. So that we're doing that job right now. And we're going to be introducing the bill. We have a bill coming in on February 15th of this next month. It's going to be going into the state legislature. We're in dialogue with the state Senate, who was the director of the California Department of Natural Resources. We've got this is the answer. The answer is to figure out how we can have something similar to Roosevelt's New Deal, that helped everybody, that brought in Social Security, unemployment insurance, the Tennessee Valley Authority, rural electrification programs. All the regular people in the country, except for the big fat corporations, they totally benefited from the New Deal. And so what we've got to do is have a New Deal that's rooted in greening the economy and having small businesses stimulated and the entrepreneurial spirit stimulated. That's what we're in the process of doing now. And so that is why I think AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is that we can provide detailed information in the bill that show people how to do this. Not just throw big old general principles around, but very detailed things. This is how it will work. This is how it will benefit you. This is how it will benefit the small businesses in your community. This is how the major corporations and the major fat cats are going to end up paying reasonable taxes to cover this stuff. That's what we're doing right now.
Okay. I know there are a lot. I know there are a lot of people. No, go ahead. Sorry, Danny. Finish that.
So that's just one other item for a whole show some other time.
I was going to say, I know there are a lot of people that are disagreeing in the chat and everything, but I always say this, that and I do think we unfortunately end up boxing people politically too. Like, just because you are for free speech, you're always for like that, because unfortunately now that has become a mostly conservative talking point. But maybe you have ideas for environment that would be left, so it's like I like hearing different opinions, and I get this all the time in the chat. So just like as a disclaimer to everybody, as I hope that we're like, what I do on my channel, I guess, is I like to learn from people, and so I don't just talk to the people who all think exactly like me, because sometimes I don't even know what I think about something, right? So it's like I appreciate it.
Very surprisingly, that most of the people who are concerned in the chat room right now about disagreeing with me, that I probably believe the things that they believe more than
that's probably, I was going to say, like when it comes to the constitutional side of things. Yeah.
They don't know it yet.
Yeah.
But that's part of my responsibility for being clear about what it is I believe, what the implications are of what I believe. But it's not knee-jerk left stuff. It's not knee-jerk right stuff that no one's been able to quite figure out exactly what it is I'm about. But I'm a constitutionalist, a Madisonian or Jeffersonian constitutionalist, not a Hamiltonian, not Alexander Hamilton, who was the lawyer that represented all the mercantile interests and financial interests that were involved in crafting the Constitution, that were basically royalists and supporting, an elite governing the country. That I am a Madisonian constitutionalist. And I think that people are like that. The people all across the spectrum are like that. And I think that what we need to do is all come to understand how we really agree with each other, and that we're being played off against each other by some of the elite who don't want us all to come together. But it's not as simple as saying, well, the left sort of comes in a circle and joins together with the right. It's not simple
Right.
like
No,
that.
it's not. And it's, yeah,
Different.
you're right. It's oversimplified as a division tool, I think, and not just
That's
by
right.
politicians, but the media too. In part because it just
That's
sells uh better, but also it's easier
so,
for a reporter who only has 90 seconds to say something to
yeah.
just have people overly simplified yelling at each other. It just makes your job a lot
Right.
easier. Lynn
That's right.
asks, what are Danny's thoughts on Nancy Pelosi invoking the 25th on President Trump just about an hour ago?
Well, the reality is that it's quite clear, and this is something that people that have been supporters of Trump have been a little bit reluctant to come to grips with. The fellow is mentally unstable. There's a certain real mental instability to him. No matter how much you wanted to champion some of the things that you might want to agree with, the guy is mentally unstable, and he's erratic, and he's dangerous. For someone to get in front of a crowd of 30,000 people and incite them to march all the way to the Capitol and stop the counting of votes, is a narcissistic maniac, and he's dangerous. Now, the short answer to anything that Nancy Pelosi advocates or says is strictly political. That what she's trying to do is gain advantage in this moment of kind of high anxiety. She's trying to gain advantage over Trump to kind of disempower him, and that's what they're trying to do. They're never going to get Pence, no matter how much Pence has betrayed Trump, or Trump thinks he's betrayed him by actually counting the votes of the Electoral College. Pence is never going to agree to that, and Pence has to agree to that under the 25th Amendment. They have to have the vice president's support of a majority of the people in the cabinet. So that's a talking point. Just like let's impeach him, with 2 weeks left to go in his term. Those are all kind of MSNBC, talking points that are not going to happen. But I do think that the basic principle that the guy's unstable, and some steps need to be taken to keep him from taking extreme measures here in the last 2 weeks. Something has to be done, and I dare say there are major conversations going on now within the confines of the national security state to keep him in check here over the next 2 weeks, to not allow him to do something extreme like to call all the people across the country who support him to seize control of the Capitol buildings, in all the blue states. He's perfectly capable of that kind of simple-minded reductionist thinking, and that something has to be done about that. I don't think that the tool of the 25th Amendment is going to work, but you remember when Richard Nixon found himself really under siege, and the discussions of genuine impeachment against him, he became really unstable, not just mean and nasty and greedy and everything that he was, but he became mentally unstable and actually was sitting in the White House drinking. Now, fortunately, Trump doesn't drink, but he is very unstable emotionally, and very egotistical, and he is liable to do something very radical here in the next 2 weeks. If you think something wasn't too radical yesterday that he did, and so that certain steps need to be taken, and so that there need to be discussions that are going on among people in both political parties, in all the factions of the political parties, to try to take whatever steps are necessary to keep him from taking extreme measures using the kind of powers that have been delegated to him over time by Congress and the Constitution to give him broad discretion in issuing orders. And care has to be taken right now. For example, he's now issued orders to accelerate the leasing of the oil fields in Alaska, to get that done right in these 2 weeks, so he can get contracts established with major oil corporations to pump and drill in the national parks, basically in Alaska. And he's doing that right this morning. So he's doing stuff, kind of burning the place down as he goes out the door here. And so some steps need to be taken.
Oh man, there's a lot. Well, so of course the chat's going crazy. Like, here, I'll just show you some. Let's see. I'm just gonna start here. So, so let me put you on the chat here, Danny. Hang on. So unstable. How many wars were started under President Trump? 0. Let's see. Enough already. Nothing's going to happen. He's the worst fascist in history.
Well, that covers the range. Those, right. Those two.
Oh gosh. Let's see. This person, thanks for the super chat. ZZY just says Ted Cruz. I don't know what that means. Okay. Mike says, this is what happens when you elect a game show host to be president. Trump's ego is his bane. I do think there is probably an interesting debate happening about, do you see Trump's personality as what has been so what's the right word? Anathema, I guess, to to his opposition, more so than his policy. Because if you were to look at policy, is he really that different in a lot of ways from his predecessors? Right. And so
we're fortunate that his personality was so excessive, and abrasive. And he's what they call a UNF leader. It's upward, negative, forward. It's a sociological graphing that's done for personalities, in that he's an upward, negative, forward person, very forward-leaning, very assertive, but very negative. And he generates hostility and attacks and enemies. And just like Hitler was a UNF leader.
Well,
and a lot of these
I still think, I'm going to push back a little bit on that, because I do think that there have been other politicians. Like, I think you could make a case that Obama was divisive, but in his own way. It was like almost like a negative divisiveness, in the sense that, like, I just think to me, and I'm not even it's not a supportive Trump thing. It's just, I get concerned, like, in having watched MSNBC, for instance, for such a long time, just like the hysteria constantly. I feel like the problem with that, and without being very careful about, which is why, like, in one of my videos, I said, if there is a military coup, I will eat McDonald's, which, if you know me, you will know, like, what that means for me. I haven't eaten McDonald's in about 15 years, and it's not on my list of like high level or even valued cuisine. And so but because I don't want, I get concerned with the other side of, like, I don't want to necessarily be a denialist, right? But I also don't want to be somebody who's the hysterical person, who's like then creating the refusal of people to listen or pay attention when we need them to, because we just cried wolf a million times. And so, but it's interesting though, Danny, because with your point of view and your thoughts on, like you said, President Trump is a danger, that's what you believe. You also are concerned about his being blocked on the internet, which I find fascinating. So could we talk a little bit about that? Because that was where I really wanted to take this conversation anyway, was like, where are we on the free speech? Because I did tell you I had that internet law expert on, and he surprised me that he really did believe, like, okay, yeah, like he would agree with you probably on President Trump, and disdain for him, but also he would also say, yeah, let's get rid of this guy. But you seem to be somebody who is more concerned about the precedent that sets and what sort of influence these tech companies have on our conversations, and what that would mean, like, when we're not hearing from the president, even if what he is saying you believe to be disinformation or even dangerous. Why let him stay on the internet? Why keep hearing from him?
Well, it's a question of what authority does the government have to make a decision about who's going to be let to do what? And this is sort of a basic libertarian position that I hold. You really have to examine the source of authority on the state in asserting its power. And you want to have as limited amount of power delegated to the state as you possibly can. And you want to have as much freedom that individual people have as possible. These platforms is that they're corporations, and the problem that arose in the 1870s when the robber barons came up with this idea of having a business vehicle that allows the people who basically own all the resources of the business, the stockholders, be completely immunized against any personal legal liability for anything the corporation does. And the management is all immunized individually. The board of directors are all immunized. And it's perfectly natural for the corporate institution to try to do anything it can possibly do to maximize its profits. And so that when the repercussions are felt by people in the community, pouring sludge into the rivers, pouring contaminants into the atmosphere, injuring their workers by not spending any money on safety procedures, et cetera. The fact is that only the corporate assets are liable for that, not the people who are gaining all the income from the profits. So that business device has to be dealt with. And the problem is that these corporations would not exist but for the exercise of power of the state. The state creates corporations, and they create a privilege for the people who own those corporations. They own the stock in the corporations to immunize them against any legal liability. That's the maximum assertion of power on the part of the elite, that they've done that. And the Libertarian Party, for years, until 25 years ago, had as one of the planks in their platform, their party platform, eliminating corporations, not allowing the state to create corporations, to immunize these people, to let them get away with what they get away with. And so that my position is that any corporation is, in fact, a creature of the state. And so therefore, the state has the right to regulate whatever the corporations do, because they can rescind their corporate charter, and they can set conditions on their corporate charter, because they wouldn't have a corporate charter but for the exercise of state power. So that it complicates this discussion, because if in fact say for example, a Google or say Facebook was a purely private company, a whole group of people, computer geeks, that got all together and figured out how to allow Facebook, and they were liable for anything that they said or did. The problem is they wouldn't be able to function, and that's why Public Law 230 exists. That Congress passed that law exempting these platforms from any legal responsibility for the content of the communications that are undertaken over their platform. And that's what's being hung over their heads right now, of saying, look, either the government is saying, either you start to regulate the content of what people are saying over your platforms, or else we're going to rescind Public Law 230.
Right.
We're going to take away your immunity against libel and slander. Okay? And so what's happened is that it's clear that the government is in fact turning the corporations of the platforms into proxies for the state. Okay? And that you can't allow to happen. You can't allow the government to be intimidating, threatening media people to get them to toe the line on what the state wants them to do. So that we have to be very careful of. And that's some of that is going on right now. The Congress and all of the liberals in this particular case posturing about how we have to censor the statements of the president. We have to censor the conservative people or the Trump supporters getting on the internet and saying things. Almost all that is coming from the liberal left side of the spectrum. Which is totally preposterous.
And journalists, just as equally preposterous.
And journalists, as you and I were talking before we came on the air, that in the midst of the people breaking windows in the Capitol building and throwing skyhooks over the banisters and climbing up the side of the building, here are the commentators on CNN saying, this is what happens if you don't censor the internet. That Trump has been allowed to put out all these lies, and these people believe what he's saying. They believe that the government's been taken over. He won the election by hundreds of votes, and so they think they're patriotic in what they're doing. The entire conversation started focusing on let's censor the internet,
right,
and let's censor the Facebook, and let's stop them from being able to say.
And they realize too that it's such an emotional time for people that it's a perfect time to swoop in with.
Insert that in.
Suppression.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And people are like, because people are just scared. They're like, okay, enough. Just do whatever you have to do to save us from this insanity.
But so I argued the case on behalf of the New York Times in New York Times versus the Jewish Defense League. Meir Kahane, represented by Roy Cohen, by the way, filed a lawsuit against the New York Times saying they wanted to publish a full-page ad condemning Leonard Bernstein, who was the head of the New York Philharmonic. He had given a contribution to the Black Panther Party to help fund their defense. I happened to be one of the lawyers for the Black Panther Party at the time. Was assisting their lawyers in protecting them against a whole bunch of false charges that were being filed against them by the city. But the bottom line is that Leonard Bernstein had given a contribution to the defense fund, and so Meir Kahane in the Jewish Defense League, right-wing fascists, what they were, by dint of having Roy Cohen to be their lawyer. But the bottom line is they filed a lawsuit against the New York Times because the New York Times refused to publish the full-page ad in which the Jewish Defense League was going to be excoriating Leonard Bernstein for giving this contribution. And the New York Times refused to take the ad. So they sued them and insisted that they had to take the ad. Because they were a major news media and they were citing the Red Lion case, which is the fairness doctrine, that if the television, but the whole theory of the Red Lion case is that the reason that the federal government theoretically had the right to regulate the content for the fairness doctrine of the three major television channels and radio channels is because the airwaves were a public property, and that the airwaves were limited in how many channels they could carry, and so therefore the federal government was therefore somehow empowered to regulate access to this public resource. Okay, which doesn't apply to the New York Times. It doesn't apply to a newspaper, and so I made the argument representing the New York Times, kick their butt and throw them in the street on the case, and we won. So that fairness doctrine of the New York Times comes up over and over and over and over of those cases of how the government, what is the theory pursuant to which the government has the right to regulate the content of the internet. This is one of my I don't fear much, I'm double Aries and I don't give a shit about what people think or say most of the time, but the threat of the government getting involved in censoring the internet is the huge danger that we face in this technological age of allowing the state to get its nose under the tent, to get in there and start controlling the content of the internet. The internet is one of the great tools that we have access to as basic people to try to rein in unjust power, both corporate power and government power, so that we need to preserve that area for us to be able to communicate with each other. And if you don't like what I say, then contradict me.
Yeah.
Or
go somewhere else
if
or
you agree with
something.
the thing,
Right.
Or go to some other channel. What do I care?
Right.
So the bottom line is the cutting off of people's access to the internet is virtually always inherently wrong. There's always another way to deal with it than just censoring people and not allowing people to say things that you don't like. And of course, the penultimate is I don't like what you're saying is to say that isn't true.
Right.
That's a big lie. And you can't say that. You can't lie. People lie all the time. And people make misjudgments all the time. People misperceive things all the time. But you can't give the power to the government to say that's untrue.
So it's interesting because the internet law expert that I was telling you about, he totally, that's how he ended our talk, was exactly what you just said. So he's equally concerned with that. But I think he also is very pro allowing these companies to just get rid of people that they want to, because they're a private company and they should be able to do what they want to do with their editorial decisions. What do you think about that? About because as you brought up the Section 230 argument, but yeah, just curious your thoughts on.
I think that they should have their corporate charters revoked.
If they do that, you're saying if they deplatform.
No, period. They shouldn't be allowed to be a corporation. They shouldn't be allowed to have their stockholders, sit back and make billions of dollars and have yachts and run around the world and all that. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. So their corporate charter, but on the other hand, I think that all corporate charters should be revoked. I do. I think that anybody who wants to engage in a business in pursuant to their entrepreneurial spirit ought to be able to be entitled to the just reward of their entrepreneurial endeavors, but they shouldn't be immunized against liability.
I see what you're saying.
They shouldn't be.
I see what you're saying.
And so the question is, if we were to strip away their corporate protections that they have. Then they're looking at it's under the libel and slander law, liable for what they publish or what they republish. Now, what we have to be able to make clear, however, is that they're not like a newspaper that is actually reviewing what the positions might be and deciding whether to endorse it. They're just like a telephone company. Mm-hmm. You know, the telephone company should not be held liable for what it is you talk about to your friend on the telephone.
Yeah. So is there a way forward? Because people ask me this question all the time. Is there a way forward where you don't scare these companies so much that they're like, well, you know what? We're just gonna we'll take our ball and go home. You know what I mean? We'll just shut down the tennis court. So it's like
they don't have a place.
Say that again.
They don't have any place to go. Well, any place to go.
So what I'm saying is, like, okay, so the argument that a lot of people pose when it comes to Section 230, for instance, is like, if you just take it away, right, then and they face liability for what I say, for instance, what you said today on YouTube, they're going to just say, you know what, Allison's too much of a risk for us. So is Danny. But we will let Fox News and MSNBC and those guys on because they're safer. They're lower risk because they're big corporations. Plus, they've got big lawyers. And so, you know, we don't want to make them mad. So is there a way to preserve the platform, I guess, as a place where you're not having these kinds of, like, just the president isn't necessarily he's the new guy, but obviously this is happening on a regular basis, right? So you're not having that happen, but they are a private company. So how do you, because to me, I can see how people would say, well, you're going to spook them so much that they're just going to say, forget you, we don't have to let you on our platform. We're a private company. Can you if you were to start forcing them to force people to be allowed on there, are you then taking the powers of the state and being, I mean, is that anti-constitutional in that sense where you're forcing a private company to do what it doesn't want to do? Is there a difference between that and forcing a cake maker to make a cake for somebody that they feel like violates their free speech? What's the difference there?
It's simple. What you do is you revoke their corporate charter, because you're revoking all corporate charters and requiring that any group of business people that are together trying to make money doing a particular endeavor be responsible for the foreseeable consequences of what they do. Okay. And you also do away with Section 230, which is a whole grant of unique power on the part of the state to them to function. You take away both of those things. Okay. And you got people that are sitting around saying, look, there's a technology that exists that enables people to talk to each other. Mm-hmm. And what you're doing is you're taking away the profit those people, because it isn't worth their time to have to undergo all the lawsuits that you're saying they're afraid of. Okay, but the technology still exists, and what you would have is a whole bunch of pirate stations. You'd have a whole bunch that aren't under government regulation that can enable people to talk to each other if they want. They can talk on the air, if you will, like we're talking right now, because the technology is now available. And it isn't, they don't have monopoly control over it. Facebook and Google and all these people have undertaken conscious plans to monopolize this particular technology that they've got. The fact of the matter is that technology is now available, and what there would be is let 1,000 blossoms bloom, and let there be all kinds of channels for us to talk to each other. And the gendarmerie might want to come in and see if you've got a computer in your house so they can smash it and try to get rid of you. But the bottom line is, I think that they should have their corporate charters revoked. I think they should not have the protection of 30 and let 1,000 blossoms bloom. And we don't have the advantage. We won't have the advantages of going on to Google and getting all the answers to everything we always wanted to know. But so what? I mean, 95% of the time, people are just sitting around the mall talking to each other about what they're buying. I mean, the vehicle for free speech, public discourse about public issues of importance, intellectual ideas, philosophical ideas, artistic ideas, we would still have access to the same technology to be able to communicate with each other without some of the conveniences that are being given to us by these big fat ass monopolies. That's all that would happen.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
And all this, the sky will fall is all not true. The sky will fall. No. But I can tell you, you take away the corporate immunity of stockholders, and half of all the major problems that exist in the country are going to start going away, because you don't have all these fat cats sitting around making tons of money on imposing damages on all kinds of people for which they're immunized.
A lot of this stuff is way over my head, but I will say what's fascinating to me is this is why I loved being a reporter and why I like talking to people, just to hear them out, because you're a great example of somebody who's got this variety of opinions and doesn't have, just, you're not just like one side versus other. You're very clear you're not a fan of Trump, but you also agree with revoking Section 230, which is something he wants to do. And so, it just goes to show that, like, if we could just let ourselves have longer conversations with people and just like hear each other out, that it doesn't mean we're going to always agree on it, but I think we would have a healthier view of the diversity of thought that a human being is capable of, and that we're not all just like bots. That, I mean, we act like that sometimes, I think, because we're trained to be that way, sometimes just by the what we're consuming. And I'm not to let people off the hook, like, you choose what you consume. So if you've been hanging out in the chat listening to this, you may be one kind of person. If you're like, screw this guy, I'm out of here, he's not saying what I want to hear, maybe that's what you want to be, that's fine, you should be able to, but you're not gonna, so I do think it's valuable to just to say that, for instance, because I do think I think I was listening, it was Tulsi Gabbard, maybe, I think she was talking earlier about just the tinderbox that we are right now as a country, or maybe it was somebody on the Hill. I think it was, and it was Crystal, Ball, who was talking about that, and she's like, it's just like a tinderbox right now, and so, like, it's just easy, like, people are just very agitated and very emotional, and who's to blame for that? Probably a million different reasons, but I do think one solution to that is to be able to really understand that though, because I think the emotional side of things comes from just that person. If you're not in my tribe, you must have all these crazy ideas, and you're the enemy, and you're all these things, but you may actually agree on some things, and that person may not actually be the monster behind the curtain that you really think that they are, the way they've been oversimplified a lot in coverage, and I do say,
well, this is the dialectic. Yeah, this is the dialectic. I mean, it is to the advantage of the rulers to have a dialectical worldview. That's why they sponsor, National Football League and National Basketball League and the National Baseball League. They have A team versus B team all the time. Everything has to be reduced to chasing a ball up and down the field, with people with different colored uniforms on. There's a training that goes on the part of the elite, training our people to think dialectically, that there's just team A and team B, and there's nothing more complex than that. And it makes it easy, because then people don't have to think. And what I'm proposing is eliminate corporations, which didn't exist. This kind of business vehicle didn't exist until 1872. It's not as though people are incapable of having private businesses and being responsible for their entrepreneurial activities. That's perfectly available to us. If we get rid of the corporations and we eliminate Section 230, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is Google and Facebook and Twitter and all these kind of groups that are providing this absolute total luxury that people have of being able to just pop on and get answers. You aren't going to have access to that. But as I said, 95% of that is useless anyhow. People aren't doing anything of any particular importance. It's just kind of, self-indulgence. But if we get rid of those things, if we get rid of all the corporations and have them be just business enterprises that are responsible for what they say and do, these companies, to the extent to which they were willing to be liable for things they say and do, would be liable for it. But all of these other groups, these pirate stations that I'm talking about, you'd have 1,000 pirate stations, what is sort of like your channel. So you have the advantage.
You're calling me a pirate?
Of having access to. Yes, absolutely. That what they call it, the ones that used to get license to raid a British ship. But the bottom line is that you'd have 1,000 pirate stations. People would know what kind of thing to listen to. You can get on your computer. We already got the computers. We got the computers already. The wiring all exists. The networks all exist. We can then talk to each other, not being filtered by Google, not being filtered by Facebook. The problem is that with those corporations monopolizing control over this technology makes them vulnerable to the state, because the state can then swoop down on them, and the state is exercising state power through the existence of monopoly, which the state created by giving them their corporate charter. And it's not coincidental. It's not accidental that this kind of a structure exists right now. It's not accidental that we're seeing all these pressures to censor the internet, because the people who run the government has been wanting to figure out how to do that for the last 50 years.
Right. Going back to Assange, right? Going back to where we started our conversation.
Yeah. We have to be willing to say, look, I'm going to be willing to forego all of these kind of luxuries of being able to, have access to Facebook or Google or Twitter, that I'll have to find some other group that's willing to provide that service for me because they have access to the technology. And so we wouldn't have all these people sitting around like vandals to invade everybody else's website.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know, kind of a pastime they engage in, the hackers. Let the hackers set up channels for us all to talk to each other on.
I wanted to get to.
It sounds like a bad idea, but it's the way to solve it.
Okay, real fast, Danny. I'm going to get to a couple of the questions and stuff. There was a lot of. I'm sorry. We're going to get them to him now. So I'll run through a couple, but
okay.
This is an interesting one, and I can read a couple more too, and you can decide. What you think's valuable. But so this Renovatio says Trump. So this was back when we were talking about like calls for insurrection or to let keep him in the White House or whatever. Yeah. Trump did not do that, Daniel. I am a qualified lawyer, and I have heard nothing from Trump seeking the crowd to stop the voting. Alan Dershowitz also stated the same today, and I would love to hear your thoughts on Dershowitz, because hasn't he been involved in some of the Trump stuff? But let's see here. Yeah. I'm just going to try to go back and see if we had.
Let me do a quick one.
Go ahead.
The part that in the morning, I knew that Trump was going to be addressing the crowds. There's no question at all that these people came to Washington, D.C. pursuant to the explicit, repeated invitation of Trump. Trump was asking them to please come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Come to Washington on January 6th because January 6th is the date that the Senate and House are going to convene to certify the Electoral College votes. There's no doubt whatsoever that Trump was intending to have the people come on that day for that reason. And he wanted them to come to Washington, D.C. to demonstrate in the streets, to be wild, as he said, in the streets, to try to put pressure on the people in Congress to refuse to certify the Electoral College votes in some 6 states, which you could predict which states they were. They were the swing states that he lost. And that was exactly what he was going to want them to challenge in order to stay in power and to pursue the fantasy. And we can also, I think, agree that he did not, in fact, win the state of Georgia by hundreds of thousands of votes. And he didn't win these other states by hundreds of thousands of votes. That's just a simple fact. Okay, so he invited these people to come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th to be wild in the streets, as his term was. And so that I tuned in on MSNBC or CNN early in the morning when I was getting set to come into the office, and I was surprised that they weren't covering his speech. Here's the President of the United States addressing a crowd of 30,000 people in the streets of Washington, and these 2 channels are refusing to broadcast it. And I said, okay, they're just refusing to do that. And so I said, I'm going to check Fox News. And so I clicked over to Fox News, and there he is. And what he's saying is, this election has been stolen. I won this election by hundreds of thousands of votes. There are criminals who are trying to take over our government and turn it over to the socialists. And that what I want you to do is I want you to be strong. I want you to march up Pennsylvania Avenue. I want you to march up the avenue to that Congress, and I want you to get up there, and I want you to basically stop them from certifying this vote. Now, he didn't say break the windows out of the place. He didn't say go into the place and trash it. What he said is, I want you to go up there and basically surround the Capitol building and put public pressure on them to stop doing what they're doing. That's what he said. And he said, I'm willing to march with you. I was surprised that he didn't march with them, because that would have been almost identical to Hitler. Hitler, in late 1929, they undertook this thing called the Push, that they marched on the Capitol building with Hitler leading them to try to oust the government that was in charge there. And remember, and this is important to know, that I know this because I know the lawyer, I know the investigator that was working for the lawyer that represented the wife of Trump when he got his divorce. And she testified in a deposition that he had a copy of Mein Kampf on his bedstand, and the second book that Hitler wrote, and he used to sit and read it at night. And the fact is, he's got this image of himself as an authoritarian leader. And that's why he respects all these authoritarian leaders around the world. He views himself as being one of them. And so that I was surprised to find that he wasn't marching at the front head of this whole group, but he, in fact, is the one that instigated them to march up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building, and to go to the Capitol building and exert pressure on the legislature to stop counting the votes and to not certify those votes so he could hold them off. That's what he was wanting to do. And that is what they did, and so the person who was asking the question, saying, I don't know, I want to be clear about what he's saying. He's basically saying he didn't hear Trump suggest that. It's clear that Trump, in fact, did that, and that he instigated those people. Now, I represented Chase Iron Eyes, who was the Democratic congressional representative or congressional candidate in North Dakota at the Dakota Access Pipeline thing. He's the only person out of the 843 people that were arrested that was charged with instigating insurrection, basically. And so I've defended him. And so I know what the elements are that need to be proven to prove that kind of thing. And there isn't any doubt in my mind that Trump instigated that crowd to march on the Capitol building. He did do that. And I think he did it thinking it was sort of like what Hitler did in the Push. And so the fact that they got out of control and started breaking the windows and marching, going into the building, etc., it brings us full circle back to our original discussion here about how similar was that to other potential occupations of major buildings. And so I'm saying that if they had gone in and occupied that building in a way that was more consistent with how people on the left side of the spectrum have occupied buildings over the past in opposition to wars and corporate greed and all that, that we wouldn't be, we'd be talking about similar issues, but we wouldn't be talking about vandals that were busting the windows out of the place, et cetera. But but I'm saying that I'm confident that he did instigate these people, and that's why he wouldn't do anything to stop them. That's why that he had his advisors pleading with him for 2 hours to go on national television and ask those people to stop and to get them to back down and leave, and he wouldn't do it. And it wasn't until Biden got on television live and confronted him person to person and said, Trump, you better step up and do this right now. And it embarrassed him. It looked like he was being one-upped by Biden. And he came out and did a 3-minute talk where he spent 2.5 minutes talking about how much he'd been violated and how they stole the election and how he understood that these people were patriotic and he fully felt their pain. And he understood what they were doing, and then said, "Oh, by the way, it's time to go home." At the very end. So that's dangerous activity on his part.
So again, a lot of people, he did not say stop the vote. He did not say that. Stop lying. So a lot of people disagreeing with you, Danny. I'm putting it out there so that we can have this conversation. Let's see here.
He didn't want.
Oh no, Hitler's
trying
back.
to get them
This guy watches too much CNN, MSNBC. But you don't like CNN and MSNBC.
No, this guy has had too many courses that actually tell him what's true. I've had too many courses studying history. I've had too many
Oh,
courses
and then
studying law.
somebody did bring this
Yes.
up though, Danny, that the video was on Twitter and Twitter censored it, so that he did produce an audio, you know, whether you feel like he was stringent enough with it, but that Twitter ripped it off, you know, saying go home.
No. He put out two Twitters. In fact, he put out a fairly mild Twitter, and then he put out a second Twitter that most of the people weren't responding to, and the call was made for him to go on national television, because they thought that him going on national television was going to be much more impactful than just a Twitter. And then he finally went on national television, and he wasn't trying to get them to stop the vote. What he was trying to do is get them to support refusing to certify. That's what he was trying to get them to do, to get the senators and congresspeople to refuse to certify the electoral college votes of those 6 states. That's what he was trying to get them to do. Now, I want to be clear about it. I assume that what he meant to do is have them surround the place and have kind of public pressure, kind of this major theater kind of thing. I don't think he was anticipating them going into the building and breaking windows out of the place, et cetera, you know, and having fistfights with the security people. I don't think he was anticipating that, but I think that he was engaged in reckless disregard for what some of the logical consequences might have been for what he was doing. Now, and if he weren't the president, I would be much more protective of his free speech rights to say things like that, you know. But when he's the president of the United States, and that's important, let's set up a separate category. The president of the United States has obligations and responsibilities that are different than just an average citizen. And so therefore, you know, while the president has the right of free speech, you know, he can't go invoking his right as a private citizen to say whatever he feels like saying, you know, and be exonerated from his responsibilities as president.
Okay, so just a couple more. Trump called for his mob to support the Republicans in objecting the vote. That in no way was telling them to storm the Capitol. Find common ground him to listen to your questions. Twitter took it down. It wasn't that no one responded. He spreads rumors like my teenager. A guy I knew said he reads Mein Kampf. Danny. So I guess they're talking about.
I've read the deposition of his wife that testified under oath about him having it on his bedstand.
Which wife was that?
His first wife.
Got it. Okay. Just trying to go. I'm sorry. I think I missed some super chats because there was so much to talk about. I'm just going back and trying to find if there's anything else. I think we'll get to the other stuff another time, Danny, because it's already been 2 hours and I feel like I even need to just go to the bathroom. It's been so long. But thanks for being on the channel. Let me just run through a few more chats from earlier.
Sure.
Where Dead Pirate Morrow. Oh yeah, that was back to our pirate conversation.
A pirate.
Let's see. I'm looking at some. Allison, Danny wants to impose big regulations but thinks that small businesses will flourish. Is kind of hypocritical. Do you think that, Danny?
No, I'm not in favor of big regulations at all. I'm in favor of imposing regulations on businesses that prohibit them from pouring sludge and poisons into the rivers, and for pouring sludge and poison in the air that's poisoning people in the whole area. Those are fairly reasonable restrictions.
Dershowitz is Epstein compromised. I'm not totally sure what that means.
Yeah. I know Dersh, so he was one of my professors.
Oh, really? Okay, so yeah, I was going to ask you about.
I know Dersh, and I know Larry Tribe, who was one of my professors as well.
Yeah, a little different, right? Because he's a defense attorney, so different perspectives on approach and whatnot from what you do. But say here, Trump just jumped on the bandwagon. So Potman says that it's basically the people were going to come no matter what. That Trump just jumped on the bandwagon. Profiteers is the word he was looking for, not pirates.
Oh yeah, profiteers.
Profiteers.
Yeah, they were pirates, most of them, but they were profiteers, and they would seize British ships. They're profiteers. That was a different motive than what I'm suggesting for pirate radio. the pirate radios are. I think the image of the pirate radio is what you want to have. Like your station here is like a pirate radio station.
Right. Yeah.
But it has the ability to see your people, and it has the ability to get chats and all this other technology, which does not have to be monopolized by Zoom or Skype or anybody else. The technology is available now that people can use it.
Okay. You can say Trump requested the crowd to assemble. You can even claim he inflamed the crowd, but he did not direct them to stop the vote. You are accusing him of something factually he did not do.
No, not to stop the vote. That he was instructing them to march up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building and to move up there and demonstrate at the Capitol building. And so the question would arise is, demonstrate to do what? To secure what? And what they were doing is they were protesting the House and Senate getting ready to certify the Electoral College vote. And the whole obvious direct implication of what he was doing was trying to intimidate them, not by burning the place down or breaking the windows out of it, but to intimidate them to not certify the Electoral College vote. It's perfectly clear what he was. Why are they going to march up Pennsylvania Avenue? Why are they going to go to the Congressional building? Why are they doing it on January 6th, right on the date where they're convening to certify the Electoral College vote? It's perfectly clear that what he was doing, and that you don't want to be defense counsel being so silly that you don't acknowledge the perfectly obvious implications of what he was doing, or the jury is going to throw your butt right out of the courtroom. That's clearly what he was doing.
Okay, I'm just trying to find you a couple more to respond to. So there are a lot of people bringing up. You did actually bring this up earlier in our chat, but maybe some people wondered or didn't miss that about the riots over over last year, not just the summer, but last year, and were those incited by, or were those just, was there any responsibility from government leaders for that stuff compared to this? How do you see those two? No. Are they different? Are they similar? What are your thoughts on that?
These are important questions that I was extremely troubled by what happened in Minneapolis, in to a lesser degree in Seattle. But to have people burning down a police station, and hundreds of people sort of dancing in the flames of the police station burning down, virtually nobody of which are being prosecuted for having done that. And here you have people on the left side of the spectrum calling for the criminal prosecution of these people. Let's use face recognition to recognize who all these people are building and get them all criminally prosecuted. You don't hear those same people calling for doing that for the kids in Minneapolis. That's that lack of objective application of neutral principles here. That was extremely troublesome to see the people going to the lengths of burning down the police station in Minneapolis. But that was not instigated. It was not instigated by any particular political office holder who utilized the power of her or his forum to stimulate those people into doing that. That didn't happen at all, and that's why it's not analogous to what was done here. That was a spontaneous uprising of all kinds of people, and they went to the length of burning the police station down. And I don't think there's a big effort to try to lay it over on Infata. That there's some sort of conspiracy group, hardcore left wing group that planned the whole thing. I was concerned about seeing a number of people all dressed exactly alike in the black things with the black helmets and in radio communications or phone communications with each other, et cetera. That was troublesome. That kind of thing that was going on in Minneapolis. But that's something that could be dealt with. But I do not think that was being instigated or coordinated by any government official that was exercising state power the way that Trump is.
Well, I think that there were people that would say that there were leaders who, even if they didn't, I do think there were government officials who were, Though I want to be careful how I speak, because I will say, like, I want to be able to come up with a specific example. I do know there were a lot of folks on the left who didn't condemn it. You know, like, well, we need to understand what's going
Well,
on,
no,
and right, and stuff like that, and you know, the what is it, the riots are the voices of the unheard, or something like that. And so I do think it's fair to look at hypocrisy on all sides of, like again, we go back to, you know, the freedom fighter and the insurrectionist, and it just depends, are they on your side or not, you know.
I was I've been troubled by that, and I've spoken out about it, that I was very concerned about the lack of objectivity of that. The lines that I draw and that I operate on are fairly clear, and they have to do with constitutional principles for the most part. You know.
Okay. Did you say? I'm sorry, I'm going back because I'm trying to monitor the chats and listen at the same time, Danny. So it's not.
No, we're fine. We're fine.
They called anarchy peaceful protests. Right, there was like a lot of that. There was like that meme that was going around with the reporter. There's like fire behind him, and it's like, it's mostly peaceful, you know. And there's just like fire.
No. I agree. No. Listen, I can outdo almost every one of the people that are pointing this out about how troubling that was. You know, the stuff that was going on in Minneapolis and Seattle. There were very serious concerns about how MSNBC and even CNN all responded, kind of rationalizing it, justifying it, you know, exonerating the people and all that. I completely agree. And I don't disagree at all with that.
Yeah, and as somebody who actually you defend people who do you know, certain, like, you know, protest actions, right? So it's not like you're right. So somebody says suggestion for Danny, though. I don't think this actually is something that you do conflate, but be more careful about Danny's got to go. Be more careful about conflating the actual left with the establishment Democrat Party faux left. But you don't have a problem conflating those two. You see that those two are different.
Well, no, I missed it.
It says, suggestion for Danny, be more careful about conflating the actual left with the establishment Dem Party faux left. But I don't think you necessarily conflate those two.
No, I don't. I'm aware of a lot of the different dynamics that are going on inside different organizations that are on the left of the spectrum and on the right side of the spectrum, and I differentiate among them all. To be frank about it, I believe that there are eight full, thoroughly fleshed out alternative worldviews. So the political spectrum has 8 different worldviews, not just 2, Republican and Democrat, not just conservative and liberal, you know, not 4 of them, just progressive and reactionary and moderate and liberal. You know, that there's 8 worldviews. And I've talked about that. I've lectured at that at universities, et cetera. And that I would think that it would probably be advantageous to have 8 political parties, each political party advocating a full-scale worldview, and what policies should be taken to effectuate the objectives of that. We can have discussions about it. We can enter into compromises with each other, the 8 political parties, you know. I think that's what they should do. And I believe that with the justices on the Supreme Court, is you should probably have 8 justices on the Supreme Court, one that represents each one of the worldviews, that can thoroughly analyze this subject by pursuant to the principles of that worldview, and then a 9th justice, who's the Chief Justice, who tries to get them to come to some sort of resolution of this. I've talked about this at great length in different places, so I'm not an ideologue on any of those positions. I believe that they're all meritorious, those views, and they're all predicated upon what factual conclusions the adherents to those worldviews come to with regard to the fundamental questions of cosmology, of how the universe came into existence, theology, about how the physical universe is unfolding. Is there some sort of ultimate objective of the universe unfolding in the way that it is? Thirdly, the ontological question as to the origins of consciousness in an otherwise unconscious universe. And fourthly, the epistemological question, the one we've been talking about today, is how do you go about ascertaining the objective truth with regard to certain factual assertions? And depending upon how a person answers any one of those 4 fundamental pillar questions, if they answer all of them in a way that is internally and self-referentially consistent with each other, they have a worldview, and it generates a philosophy that goes behind it. And we talk in terms mostly of the worldviews of being authoritarian, reactionary, conservative, moderate, liberal, progressive, and utopian. So there are whole political worldviews that go along with these things. And the problem is most people don't think very clearly about all this. They don't understand the differences among and between these things, and they therefore don't understand what the area for compromise is between and among these worldviews. And it's okay, because what I'm saying is that in addition to having these pirate stations to substitute for Google and the platforms, I believe that it's going to be much more difficult to exercise your rights as a citizen. You're going to have to spend more time thinking. You're going to have to spend more time reading. You're going to have to spend more time listening to other people's points of views, and you can't be lazy citizens. And that's why Google has the power it has. That's why Facebook has the power it has, because people want to be lazy. We're being trained into being lazy. And I think that we need to be, strong citizens, healthy citizens, to spend more time talking with each other about these issues, like you do, and like your listeners do.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go back to this. Well, I will say, and I'll wrap it up because I know we got to run. And I have seen it confirmed this for me, Danny. Did you have some involvement in papers that describe like UFOs or aliens or something?
Oh yeah.
We got to do something on that at some point in time.
I'm legal counsel for the Disclosure Project, which has been advocating disclosure of the classified information relating to unidentified flying objects. I think it's an extraordinarily important issue.
Yeah.
And anybody with an IQ above room temperature knows I'm right.
I totally want to do a whole other chat on that, because I find that issue fascinating, and it was really interesting to see how that was I think that was part of the stimulus bill, which who knew that? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they did. They put a provision in there. Rubio got it put in there to make them not reveal the information to the public, interestingly enough, but to brief the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I'll just say in closing on this, that back in October, there was a briefing of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, in which the director of the new division inside the Office of Naval Intelligence that has been tasked with gathering together the information about UFOs, that he, in closed-door session, said that the majority of people on this task force, an official U.S. government task force, employees of the United States government with dental coverage, actually were saying that most of them believed that these were extraterrestrial vehicles, and that they were coming from an extraterrestrial civilization, and that it was important to get this information addressed in a responsible way. Mm-hmm. And people are just kind of gaily going along, going to the mall and buying and selling, laying waste their powers, and not paying any attention to this. Well, we've got a full flotilla. We got a whole battle group of the USS Nimitz, stay off Baja, monitoring the coming and going of these vehicles. And there's this whole kind of censoring of all the information on the major news networks, mm-hmm. except once in a while they break through, when they get a straight up video released of one of these things being pursued by an F-18.
Yeah, there's a lot there to talk about. It's really interesting. I am one last quick question, going kind of back to it, because it does, again, like the way that you see Trump, I do think it can inform how much space you want to give him on the internet, you want to give him on TV, how nervous you are right now, all these things. Do you think, Danny, if in fact you were to be somebody who's like, okay, no, this guy, they align with you, and they're concerned that he's got these despotic tendencies, and you had COVID as an opportunity for him to use the federal government to do what but he didn't. But a lot of people will argue then, but that was a failure on his part. But can you argue both things? Can you argue that he's a tyrannical dictator, Hitler-like guy, but also that he failed on a federal response to a pandemic. Like, can those two things live together? Because doesn't that show that he didn't, enact federal authorities?
No, there are ways in which he's incompetent, in the same way that Hitler was incompetent. It was completely ridiculous for Hitler to invade Russia, while he still had all the battle going on the Western Front. It was totally incompetent for him to make that type of decision. If he hadn't made that decision, he probably would have taken over all of Europe. Not that I'm advocating that. Well, I'm glad he was incompetent. And I'm glad that Trump is competent in a number of ways. But it's not for the lack of trying.
Okay, I see where you're saying. Well, because I do think I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you're saying. Like that there's personality similarities. Is that what you're trying? Is that what you're going after?
Yes.
or
and ideological. He's a fascist.
Okay.
In fascism is the proposal to put the instrumentalities of government at the disposal of the interests of major privately owned corporations. That's what fascism actually is. It happens to tend to be authoritarian as well, but that's a different position. The fact of the matter is that he's a fascist. He believes, along with all kinds of people like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, there were a whole bunch of these people that believed that the best way to organize the American economy and government is to have the government put all of the instrumentalities of the state at the disposal of the corporations, like United Fruit, to have an invasion of Panama and have an invasion of Nicaragua and overthrow the government down there for the benefit of United Fruit. These are clear things that a fascist believes in, and they think it's a good idea.
It's just
No, it's for example.
Go ahead.
He says the United States is now the number one producer of energy in the world. He's talking about the corporations. He's talking about the 7 major oil corporations that are all privately owned, and the United States government is spending billions of dollars invading the Middle Eastern oil fields to keep monopoly control over the oil fields. And like people don't think hard enough about this stuff. They just spend a little bit of time. They treat these issues like it's entertainment rather than studying what's really going on.
Well, I will say it's, of course, the chat's blowing up again. I'm not gonna.
Yes.
But you know what? At the end of the day, everybody's entitled to their thoughts on this, and nobody can argue. I hate it when people say to somebody they disagree with that they're just stupid or whatever. Like, obviously, you're not a stupid person. You're a very highly skilled, intelligent person who has come to this conclusion. So if I had more time, I would like to debate how you got there and learn more about that. But I wish people wouldn't just say, and it does it to people. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but maybe my brain is just fried at this point. But I do think it's an opportunity to just say, hey, listen, like, again, I've been very clear that I'm hesitant, and it's not even hesitant. Like, I don't want to create, because I do think with the hysterical energy that sometimes the people, the media that just has been negatively obsessive about Trump over time has also created the deafness on the other side, that they're like, why won't these people, think about this? Why won't these people listen to us? Why won't they take us seriously? And it's like, because people just can't hear this constantly when you didn't say this about other political leaders that, by policy standpoints, were not totally, entirely divergent from this guy. And so where were you on that? And so there's always this whataboutism. And then there's just it's just like a dog in heat with Trump. And so I just don't want to push people to the other side, which is I talk about him realistically, because he's not a perfect guy by any means, 100%. But let's be realistic too, because I don't want to say what?
No, he's a narcissist in the same way that Bill Clinton was. People on both sides of the political spectrum can be narcissists, and they can be egotistical. They can be self-serving. They can be duplicitous. There's all kinds of things. And the fact of the matter is that I have been publicly critical of all kinds of people in the Democratic Party and Republican Party. Half of my friends come and say, how can you possibly spend your time criticizing people in the Democratic Party? Don't you realize that we all have to join together and just criticize Trump? Yeah. I say, no, I don't agree with that at all. I'm perfectly critical of it. And that's why I, in fact, support the critiques of the of the Biden administration right now. I am devoted now that they've won control of the Senate and the House and the White House, they can be held accountable for the all too moderate set of solutions that they're proposing for all kinds of public policy problems. They're not having a progressive enough view of how to solve these problems because they're beholden to the oil companies. They're beholden to Goldman Sachs for their campaign contributions, et cetera. So I've been critical of them all. It causes people great distress because they have a hard time trying to figure out, well, what's the story? What is this guy really saying? You know?
Okay, last couple things. Trump did not have a copy of Mein Kampf on his nightstand. The claim by Ivana... Oh, wait, here, hang on. Claim by Ivana that Donald Trump kept a book of Adolf Hitler's speeches in his bedside cabinet.
No.
No.
He had both books. Okay. He had Mein Kampf and he had a thing of his speeches. And it wasn't Ivana. It was, in fact, his first wife in a sworn deposition in their divorce case. And so I was very specific about what the source was. And it's not Ivanka. It's his first wife.
I don't know.
And then very important, if you don't have the chat line burning up, we're not doing our job. People sitting around going, oh, I'm just listening kind of passively to things he's saying, and I agree with everything he says, then it wouldn't be worth our spending the 2 hours together. It's important for people to think seriously about these things, disagree when they disagree, ask the right questions, and then give an opportunity to hear what the answer is, and then discuss it.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was what debate was about. And it's funny too, Danny. There was a guy that I had on who he was talking about the election. He works for, I don't know what his, like, looking back on it, I guess he's a statistical economist. I mean, I'm trying to think of what his exact title is, but he was a research professor at ASU and was part of MIT's AI program, and he does stuff out of Baylor. And he was talking about the polls prior to the election and thinking that they were going to end up being wrong. And I thought that was interesting because 2016 was this bizarre, people were so shocked by that. And so I have that guy on the channel, and the people on the left were like, this guy's a federalist, all these things, and how could you have him on the channel? And then and then people get, so I don't know. Whatever. It's my channel, right? It's my pirate channel. I can talk to who I want to.
That's exactly right. That's right. You can do whatever you want on your pirate channel. And I'm here to defend that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. Well, Danny,
and the right for asking the questions. I'm here to defend their right to ask these questions.
Yes.
Because they should ask those questions. I'd be more upset if they were just laying back and letting this sort of waft over them as some form of entertainment.
Yeah, no, they're definitely engaging. Yeah, that's for sure. I can't read them all. They're coming in so fast. So, and I will be honest with you. I probably need a caffeine boost. I don't know if do you drink coffee, Danny?
No, I've never drunk a cup of coffee.
Are you serious?
In my entire life.
Now you're starting to sound like Hitler. Didn't he not drink coffee?
No.
Oh.
No, he was weird.
He was a teetotaler, though. He didn't drink alcohol, right?
No. No, he was because I was playing football and basketball and baseball through high school and baseball and football in college, and our coaches didn't want us to do that. So I never got into the habit of doing it. And that's why people get into the habit of drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, because it's a peer group pressure thing. And they just do it to try to be cool, and then they get addicted. And I've avoided that.
Okay. Sorry, I think we're just going to call it, Danny. I can't keep up with the chats, and I appreciate everything you said. We're definitely going to have to talk about aliens and extraterrestrials, and I don't know what the PC term is for them. Probably, our space neighbors?
Well, it depends. You can call them anything you want. They don't mind.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to talk about that. Okay. Well, thanks again for doing this. And I do really appreciate your time, and have a good rest of your day. We'll see what happens in Washington, D.C. And we'll definitely talk UFOs next time.
Yeah, so just holler to me whenever the Capitol is invaded or anything else. We'll we'll chat.
I appreciate it.
There may be more to come. There may be more to talk about between now and January 20th. We'll see what
Oh
happens.
yeah, I feel like every day is a year nowadays. So all right, Danny, thanks
Yes.
again.
Yeah. Terrific, Allison. Thank
All
you so
right.
much, and thank you to all your
Yeah.
listeners, all your
Yeah,
chat
thanks,
people.
guys.
I appreciate their.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Terrific. Bye.